Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Welcome to the deep dive. So, imagine sitting down with a major world leader, right? You ask him why he just launched the largest European land war since World War II.
Right. You'd expect to talk about, I don't know, recent border skirmishes or troops.
Exactly. You're expecting a modern geopolitical answer. But instead of mentioning NATO troops or broken trade agreements from like last month, he starts talking about a Scandinavian prince from the year 862.
Yeah, it's wild. But that is exactly what happened when Tucker Carlson sat down with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
It is. And today, we are taking you inside the architecture of that exact justification. We're mapping out the historical events, the geopolitical grievances that led up to the conflict in Ukraine, but we're looking at this entirely through the lens of Vladimir Putin's worldview.
And it is absolutely crucial to set some ground rules with you right up front.
Yeah, please do.
Because to understand the mechanics of any major conflict, you really have to understand exactly how the primary actors justify it to themselves and to their people, obviously. So just to be clear, we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Right, and not at all.
We are not validating them, and we certainly aren't taking sides. Our mission today is just to simply deconstruct the narrative that Putin presented.
Yep. And to do that, we're relying on two primary sources. We have the official transcripts of Putin's February 24th, 2022 nationwide address, the one announcing the start of the military operation.
And we also have that expansive February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson.
Exactly, because, when you look at these sources, you realize his rationale doesn't start with modern politics, at all.
No, not even close.
When he's asked why he initiated this conflict, you expect an answer about some imminent physical threat. But Putin demanded to start 1,000 years ago. And that timeline completely changes the paradigm of how you have to look at this crisis.
It really does, because by framing this conflict through a 1,000-year-old lens, he isn't just, giving a history lesson.
Right.
He is laying the foundation for a very specific legal and moral defense.
So let's get into the mechanics of that history.
Mm-hmm.
Putin traces the centralization of the Russian state back to the year 862.
Right, when the townspeople apparently invited Prince Rurik to rule.
Yeah, but the real linchpin in his narrative happens a little later, in 988, with the baptism of Russia. Prince Vladimir adopts Orthodoxy, so Eastern Christianity.
And that's a huge moment for his argument.
It is, because Putin relies on this exact moment to argue that this territory was forever united, united spiritually, linguistically, through Old Russian, and economically.
He paints a picture of this vast, naturally cohesive territory.
But, as with many sprawling medieval empires, cohesion rarely lasts, right?
Yeah, exactly. The throne splinters among various sons, the Mongol horde invades and weakens the southern territories, and that fragmentation creates a vacuum.
And this is where the villain of his early historical narrative enters the picture.
Right, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. They begin absorbing those southern and western Russian lands.
And what's really vital to understand here is how he frames what happened next. He doesn't just describe a simple change in borders. He describes a deliberate cultural erasure.
Yeah, he points to a decades-long process of what he actually calls polonization.
Right.
The Polish state, in his telling, forced their language onto the local population, and they actively tried to convince them that they were not Russian at all, but rather a separate ethnic group called Ukrainians.
And the linguistic mechanism he uses here is fascinating. He argues that the word Ukrainian didn't originally denote a distinct ethnic identity.
No, in Old Russian, the root of the word essentially meant fringes or outskirts.
Right, it was used to describe people living on the borderlands.
Like border patrol guards, basically.
Exactly. So his argument rests on the idea that a separate Ukrainian identity was this artificial construct forced upon a captive Russian population by an oppressive foreign power.
Which brings us to 1654. Putin highlights a local leader named Bogdan Khmelnytsky.
Right, and he wrote to Moscow, right?
Yeah, begging the Russian state to take these lands back under its protection, to save their Orthodox faith from Polish oppression.
And Moscow agrees. They reclaim Kiev, bring the lands east of the Dnieper River back into the fold.
And Putin uses this historical loop to establish a core premise. He says these lands naturally gravitate back to Moscow because they fundamentally are Moscow.
And, that premise really sets up his immense hostility toward the leaders of the Soviet Union in the 20th century.
Well, absolutely, because if you accept his premise that this is all historically Russian land,
then the actions of Vladimir Lenin after the 1917 revolution look like a catastrophic betrayal.
Exactly. Because Lenin draws new borders. Putin is adamant that Lenin essentially artificially created the Soviet Republic of Ukraine.
And he didn't just create it. Putin argues Lenin gifted it vast tracts of historical Russian land that had zero historical connection to Ukraine.
Right, he specifically points to the entire Black Sea region. He notes that it was conquered by Catherine the Great long before the Soviet Union even existed.
The architecture of his grievance here is really built on the idea that Soviet leaders, so Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, they were treating the country like a massive administrative sandbox.
Yeah, just shifting internal borders for political convenience.
And to Putin, these internal lines didn't really matter while the Soviet Union was intact.
But they became a geopolitical ticking time bomb the moment the USSR collapsed. Because suddenly, those arbitrary administrative lines became actual international borders.
I think the best way to conceptualize this is through a property dispute analogy. But it's deeper than just holding an old deed.
How so?
Well, imagine you're trying to claim legal ownership of your neighbor's house today based on a 1,000-year-old parchment deed proving your ancestors built the original foundation.
Right, completely ignoring who has lived there for the last few centuries.
Exactly. But the crucial insight here is how Putin uses this analogy. He knows an ancient deed won't hold up in a modern international diplomatic court.
Of course not.
But he isn't trying to win an international court. He is using that ancient deed to convince his own domestic family that the neighbor is just a squatter.
Ah, right. By defining Ukraine as an artificial state, he structurally attempts to categorize the entire conflict as an internal family dispute.
Yes. Which completely bypasses the jurisdiction of international law in his mind.
That is the absolute core of his strategy. He explicitly views Russians and Ukrainians as one big family. And he believes the West has intentionally weaponized those arbitrary, poorly drawn Soviet borders to split that family apart, specifically to weaken Russia.
Okay, so if Putin genuinely believes Ukraine is an inseparable part of Russia's historical body, the immediate question is, why didn't he react with military force when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991?
Right. If it was such a tragedy, why let it happen?
Exactly. And his answer to that reveals a deeply paranoid view of post-Cold War Western diplomacy. Putin argues that Russia voluntarily agreed to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he makes a big point of that. They didn't lose a war, they chose to dissolve the empire.
And because it was a voluntary dissolution, the Russian expectation was that they would be welcomed into what Putin calls the civilized West as an equal partner.
They expected to co-create a brand new global security architecture. But his narrative dictates that the West immediately took advantage of Russia's vulnerability instead.
Right. He points squarely to the famous, albeit debated verbal assurance from Western leaders that NATO would not expand an inch to the east.
Yet, as he notes, there were 5 subsequent waves of NATO expansion.
The Baltics, Eastern Europe moving the military infrastructure right up to the Russian border.
But instead of just getting angry right away, Putin actually claims he spent his early presidency trying to join them.
Yeah, this is where his worldview really solidifies. He recounts a meeting in the Kremlin with outgoing U.S. President Bill Clinton in the year 2000.
Oh, this story is wild. Putin says he asked Clinton directly, if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen?
And Clinton allegedly replied, I think so.
But then later that evening, Clinton supposedly walked it back, saying his team had determined it just wasn't possible.
He also details pitching a joint U.S.-Russia-Europe missile defense system to George W. Bush. Like, he thought they could tackle global strategic security together.
Right. Putin says Bush's top team, the Secretaries of Defense and State, sat at his table, agreed it was a logical idea, but ultimately just told Russia to get lost.
And you see, Putin points to these specific rejections as the exact moment he realized the West didn't want a partner.
No.
They wanted a defeated vassal.
He argues that the United States decided to dominate the post-Cold War world, adopting a posture of absolute superiority. And to maintain that dominance, they operate what he famously calls an empire of lies.
Yeah, the empire of lies. And he doesn't just use that as a kitschy slogan. He tries to build a legal precedent with it.
How did he do that?
Well, he cites the NATO bombing of Belgrade in Yugoslavia in 1999, which happened without UN Security Council sanction.
Ah, right.
And he leans heavily into the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. He specifically references U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell holding up a vial of white powder at the UN.
Claiming it was a weapon of mass destruction.
Right, which of course turned out to be entirely false.
The mechanism here is really crucial. Putin isn't just complaining about American hypocrisy. He is using Yugoslavia and Iraq to establish a precedent that the United States willfully fabricates evidence and ignores international law whenever it suits their strategic interests.
Right, so if the system is already broken by the West, he argues, well, then Russia is not bound by it either. But let's look at the underlying psychology here. If Putin was actively asking to join NATO and pitching joint missile defense systems, how does he explain the total failure of his own diplomatic efforts? Why couldn't he make a deal?
That's the thing. He fundamentally doesn't believe that elected Western leaders actually run their own countries.
Wait, really?
Yeah. His experience convinced him that the permanent bureaucracy, sort of specifically the intelligence agencies, they are the ones pulling the strings.
Right, the whole deep state argument.
Exactly. He illustrates this with a story about the CIA in the early 2000s. Putin claims he found hard evidence that U.S. intelligence was actively supporting and funding Chechen terrorists in the Caucasus.
Right, and treating them as political opposition to destabilize Russia from the inside.
Right. And he says he took this evidence directly to President Bush.
And Bush told him he would handle it, didn't he?
He did. But later, Putin claims the CIA sent a message to Russian intelligence essentially saying, "We believe this is the right thing to do, and we are going to keep doing it."
Wow. That specific incident is really the Rosetta Stone for his geopolitical paranoia.
Absolutely. It's cemented his belief that it didn't matter who was sitting in the Oval Office or what promises were made at a summit.
The permanent underlying goal of the American intelligence and military apparatus was to fracture and subdue the Russian state. To him, diplomacy was just theater.
But, a philosophical grievance about the CIA and a 1,000-year-old historical debate, that doesn't trigger an invasion on its own.
No, that abstract paranoia needed a physical, geographic catalyst. And in Putin's timeline, that catalyst hit right on Russia's border in 2008, the Bucharest summit.
2008 is really where the abstract threat becomes a map. At the Bucharest summit, despite severe reservations from countries like Germany and France, U.S. President George W. Bush pressured the European allies to declare that NATO's doors would eventually be open to Ukraine and Georgia.
And to Putin, that is the ultimate non-negotiable red line.
Because he argues that Russia agreed to the post-Soviet borders with the explicit understanding that Ukraine would remain neutral.
Exactly. They never agreed to the possibility of NATO military bases on historical Russian soil. And then the pressure cooker finally explodes in 2014, the Maidan Revolution.
And to understand 2014 from Putin's perspective, you really have to look at the economics.
Right.
Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych paused an association agreement with the European Union. Why? Because the Russian and Ukrainian economies were deeply intertwined.
Shared manufacturing, open borders, integrated supply chains.
Exactly. If Ukraine opened its markets entirely to the EU, European goods would flood through Ukraine right into the Russian market. It would devastate Russian domestic industries. So Yanukovych asked for time to calculate the economic impact.
But that pause triggered massive pro-Western protests in Kiev, ultimately leading to Yanukovych fleeing the country.
Right.
And Putin doesn't view this as a democratic uprising. He firmly, without any hesitation, categorizes the 2014 revolution as an armed, CIA-backed coup.
He frequently cites a figure that it cost the U.S. $5 billion to execute.
Yeah, which is a reference to funds the U.S. provided for democracy building in Ukraine over the years. But for Putin, the sole purpose of this coup was to install a hostile, pro-Western puppet government right on his doorstep.
And this is where he justifies his first military response. In reaction to this coup, Putin argues Russia had a moral and strategic obligation to secure the naval base in Crimea.
And to support the Russian-speaking uprisings in the eastern Donbass region, which kicks off an 8-year localized conflict.
Which brings up the most glaring logical question in this entire timeline.
Yeah, if the existential threat was a CIA coup in 2014, why wait until 2022 to launch a full-scale military operation? Why let 8 years pass?
Right, and his answer points directly to the Minsk agreements.
Remind us what those were.
These were international peace plans brokered by France and Germany to settle the Donbass conflict. The agreements kept the Donbass region within Ukraine, but granted it special political autonomy.
Okay.
Putin claims he honestly wanted to implement them. He thought over time the political wounds would heal and the region would stabilize.
But he argues the Ukrainian leadership explicitly refused to implement the autonomy provisions.
Yes. But more importantly, he points to subsequent admissions by Western leaders. Both Angela Merkel and François Hollande, who brokered the agreements, later stated publicly that the Minsk agreements were actually crucial for giving Ukraine time to build up its armed forces.
Wow. So for Putin, that was the ultimate validation of paranoia.
Exactly. He felt he had tried diplomacy, but the West was simply stringing him along, using peace treaties as a smokescreen to pump a hostile neighbor full of NATO weapons.
He fell backed into a corner where military force was his only remaining option. And that perceived trap snapping shut brings us to the morning of February 24th, 2022.
The launch of what he designated the special military operation.
Yeah. In his nationwide address, he stated he was invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter to stop an ongoing genocide against the millions of Russian-speaking people in the Donbass.
And it's vital to look at the mechanism of how he uses Article 51. Article 51 is the international right to self-defense against an armed attack.
Right.
By officially recognizing the breakaway Donbass republics as independent states just days prior, and then having them request military assistance, Putin is actively attempting to use the United Nations' own legal frameworks to legitimize his invasion.
He is mirroring the legal justifications the West used in places like the Middle East. It's very calculated.
It is.
He outlined two primary goals for the operation: to demilitarize and to denazify Ukraine. And we really have to unpack that word denazify.
I do, because for an international audience, hearing that is incredibly jarring, especially knowing that the current Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish.
Right. So how does Putin build a logical argument that he is fighting Nazis in a country led by a Jewish president?
Well, to understand this, you really have to understand the trauma of World War II in the Russian psyche. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million lives fighting Nazi Germany.
Right. It's unimaginable.
So Nazism isn't just a historical term for them, it is the ultimate trigger word for existential evil. Putin argues that when Ukraine became independent, it struggled to form a cohesive national identity.
And instead built its modern mythology around extreme nationalist figures like Stepan Bandera.
Exactly. And Bandera is a highly complex figure. He was a Ukrainian nationalist who fought for an independent Ukraine against the Soviet Union.
But to do so, he initially collaborated with Nazi Germany, right?
Precisely. And Putin weaponizes that duality. He points out that Bandera's factions were involved in the mass extermination of Poles, Jews, and Russians alongside the SS.
And Putin argues that modern Ukraine has erected monuments to these collaborators, marched with their flags, and made them national heroes.
So when Putin looks at Zelensky, he argues that Zelensky's religious background is essentially irrelevant. He sees a president who capitulated to violent neo-Nazi nationalist factions just to maintain his grip on political power.
And he actually uses a very specific modern incident to hammer this narrative home. During his interview, Putin points to an event where the Canadian Parliament gave a standing ovation to a Ukrainian World War II veteran.
Oh, right.
It was later revealed that this veteran had served in the Waffen-SS, a Nazi unit that carried out atrocities.
And for Putin, that wasn't just a vetting error by Canada. It was absolute proof that the toxic ideology he's fighting is still actively supported by the West.
Which serves a massive strategic purpose domestically. By framing the enemy not as the Ukrainian people, but as a Nazi junta holding the population hostage, he completely bypasses domestic opposition to the war.
Yeah, he frequently tells Ukrainian soldiers to lay down their arms and go home. He argues their grandfathers didn't fight Hitler just to let neo-Nazis take power today.
He frames the entire invasion as a rescue mission to save a part of the Russian family from a Western-controlled cult.
Which inevitably leads to the question of how this all ends. Because despite the ongoing devastation, Putin insists that Russia is, and always has been, willing to negotiate a peaceful settlement.
Right. He points to early 2022, shortly after the troops crossed the border, claiming a comprehensive peace document was drawn up during negotiations in Istanbul.
According to his narrative, they had reached a very high stage of coordination. He claims they had agreed on terms where Ukraine would remain neutral and that neo-Nazism would be prohibited at a legislative level.
He even asserts that the head of the Ukrainian delegation put his preliminary signature on the draft document.
But then, he says, the West intervened to keep the war going.
Yeah. He claims that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrived in Kiev and convinced the Ukrainian government to walk away from the table.
Johnson allegedly told them it was better to fight Russia on the battlefield, promising that the West would supply all the necessary financial and military backing.
And following this, Putin notes that President Zelensky signed a legal decree making it a criminal offense to negotiate with Russia.
And that anecdote loops right back to his foundational grievance.
That the West is pulling the strings.
Exactly. To Putin, Ukraine is not acting as an independent sovereign actor. They are a satellite state, a proxy doing the bidding of Washington and London.
Therefore, in his mind, the conflict grinds on not because Russia refuses to negotiate, but because the empire of lies is perfectly willing to use Ukrainian lives to inflict a strategic bleeding defeat on the Russian state. So when you step back and look at the entire architecture of this justification, it is sprawling.
It really is.
We've traced how his narrative relies on a 9th century prince and a religious baptism to establish an unbreakable family bond.
We've seen how he weaponizes the shifting borders of the Soviet Union to bypass international law today.
We mapped his deep-seated paranoia regarding the CIA and post-Cold War NATO expansion, culminating in his view that the 2014 revolution was a Western coup.
And the 2022 invasion was a legally justified defensive maneuver against a Nazi-sympathizing proxy state.
It is a worldview where history is never just in the past. It is an active, breathing mechanism used to justify present-day military force.
Every ancient grievance is linked to a modern geopolitical paranoia.
Which leaves you with a deeply unsettling reality to consider. If a global leader's worldview is entirely shaped by thousand-year-old borders, historical trauma, and a foundational belief that Western diplomacy is inherently deceptive,
Right.
how do traditional modern diplomatic tools like economic sanctions or ceasefire treaties even begin to bridge that gap? Can a 21st century diplomatic solution ever successfully resolve what is fundamentally a 9th century grievance?
That tension right there between modern statecraft and ancient imperial mythology is really the defining geopolitical puzzle of our time.
Remember, you cannot resolve a property dispute if one side is using a modern surveyor's map and the other side is using a 1,000-year-old deed to convince his family that the neighbor doesn't even exist. Thank you for joining us as we deconstructed this perspective on the deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.